Welcome to the Love Your 9 to 5 show, episode number 9.
Caution, you will begin to love your 9 to 5 with this show. Join us as we explore and discover your unique strengths and learn to apply them to your daily business activities with your host, Shmuel Septimus.
Welcome everybody to this next episode of the Love Your 9 to 5 podcast, where we bring on influential business leaders and thought leaders to bring you the value and information and tools that we all need in order to get a little bit better and stronger and getting in touch with our superpowers. My guest today is Davis Mutabwa. Davis is a startup business consultant, a podcaster, a church branding specialist, public speaker, and business coach who lives in Melbourne, Australia. Davis, it's a pleasure speaking to you today. And can you start us off a little bit with just telling us a little bit more about yourself, personally and professionally, so that our audience can get a little bit more familiar with who they're speaking with today?
Hey, thanks, Shmuel, for having me on the show. I'm so excited, and it's an honor to have you here. This just speaks to the power of networking and the power of LinkedIn. So we just connected over LinkedIn, and we got chatting, and here we are. So you're a great example of what can be done through social media. And yeah, thank you for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be here. A little bit about myself. I'm based over here in Melbourne, Australia, with my wife and our 5-year-old daughter. And we've been out here probably about 12, 13 years. Migrated from Zambia in 2005, which is where I studied my chartered accounting. And then I started work over in Botswana. I worked over there for 4 years back in chartered in audit. So working for one of the big 5 firms. And yeah, it's been purely doing lots of accounting work, lots of auditing, sitting in lots of boardrooms with small to medium-sized clients, just advising them on how they can grow their businesses, advising them on how they can control their financials and make sure that everything is being done with the right governance levels. And a couple of years ago, I decided to start looking into starting my own business while I was working full-time. And so I've been doing that, coaching and working full-time in the accounting industry, and on and off. Sometimes I work full-time in my business. Sometimes I've been working full-time in accounting. So at this very moment, I just picked up a full-time role working for a financial services company, helping them with their financial reporting. And that's going great. And then I'm still running my own podcast, which I launched probably about 2 months ago. And that's been an awesome thing, and that's really exciting. So that's a little bit about snapshot.
Yes, no, I really appreciate that snapshot that you gave. Let me ask you a question, Davis. I know that you were definitely very involved in the corporate world, and at a point you started working on the side, by yourself and moving into starting your own business. What was the push that made you decide that you wanted to move out of the corporate world and into starting your own business?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll start with this. I believe nature tells us a little bit about how we operate as human beings. And anytime we plant a seed, it takes a little while for that seed to germinate, and a little while longer for that seed to actually grow, and a little while longer yet for that seed to begin to produce fruit. And so what's happened for me is back in about, maybe let's say nine years ago, somebody put into my hands the book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And this was while I was working back in Botswana. And that's probably over 12 years ago. And that's the book by Robert Kiyosaki. And after I read that book, I kind of got the bug to begin to, or the seed rather, to keep the analogy going, the seed to say, you've got to find a way to generate passive income because at some point, maybe your job income will not be there, but you still need to have some income that is not dependent on you expending hours in exchange for dollars. So that's when that seed got planted. But then come 2009, I walked into my office, just to cut the story short, and I was working as a finance manager for a listed organization here in Melbourne. And I was told, and I kind of knew what this story was because I'd been in the board meetings and previous to that, and the board was asking us to start doing cuts to our staffing. Okay. And so I was one of the people who got laid off that afternoon. And Shmuel, that was like 4 o'clock in the evening or afternoon, and I was told, hey, this is your final day. We've already put the money into your account. Could you please go back to your office and wrap up everything you're doing and give us the keys at 5 p.m. as you leave the office? So that was it. 1 hour time, and you got to get out. And it was a second time this was happening. The first time was slightly different, but really this was the first pure redundancy that I was going through. And I thought I'd get 2 weeks to finish. We were just trying to finish off the accounts to publish to the market. So I thought, every single time you're in a role, you think nobody else can do what you're doing because you're so good at it, or they will struggle to finish what you're working on. It's never true, because we've found that role and someone else was in there before us. And it just means that don't get too complacent, don't get too comfortable, because we're all replaceable in a big organization, and somebody else can pick up from where you left off from. And that's not in a bad way or a good way. That's just the reality. That's just a fact check. So I left that afternoon, and I was driving home and I called my wife, called a couple of friends and said, hey, guess what? I've got no more work to do. I've got no more job, rather. And that's what kind of shook me up. Now, thankfully, before that, we had already started preparing ourselves, and I had invested in a couple of real estate courses. So that threw me into working full time in our own real estate company, doing shared accommodation for international students around the university areas. So that was a sort of a six-figure income revenue, but then the profit margins were pretty low, and so within a short space of time, and the student population is a population that requires you to give them the absolute cheapest, and I just didn't have the right strategy. So after about a year or two, I shut that business down and went back to full-time work in accounting, and that's first episode. Yeah.
Okay. So basically, if I could sum that up, it basically seems like that you were kind of inspired by the book, and you also wanted that security of not being able to trade your time for dollars, and you could actually have a business that kind of makes money based on the work that you put in initially. But then after you got laid off, it was you kind of forced, perhaps quicker than you wanted to be forced, into really just embracing it, quicker than you wanted to. But that's definitely a very assured way to kind of start something. In hindsight, do you find that it was a blessing in disguise that kind of forced you to get really uncomfortable with yourself?
Yeah, I mean, in hindsight, you always look back and you say, well, if that didn't happen, what would have happened? But the biggest lesson for me at that point was it threw me into something that I had never done before, and we survived. It wasn't like we went onto the streets or anything like that. It was tough, but it just gives you a little bit of a reality check, and it tests you to say, are you really committed to this journey of doing something for yourself? And the reality is it takes a little bit longer than we expect, and it costs a little bit more than we expect always. So that was a good thing. That's a good learning.
Excellent. Let me ask you, Dave, can you recall of a particular success that you had either early on in your career, or even once you started your own business, something that you think perhaps others can tap into and can mimic in their own careers? Any particular examples that come to mind?
Yeah, so I'll bring that right up to a more recent situation where I worked full-time for GE Capital, or General Electric, their financing division, for about 6 years. The company got shut down, and I went through another big redundancy with lots of other people. And that was probably about 2 years ago, maybe 18 months ago. And that's when I really kicked back into saying, right, I need to launch something that I can run on the side of my consulting, I can run on the side of my coaching, I can run on the side of any full-time role that comes back up on my radar. So that's when I really buckled down and started doing the pre-launch for my podcast. And the real success for me was that it was a little bit hard to work everything out, and it took me probably close to 1 year after I had recorded my first interview to the time I actually launched. But I persisted and persisted and persisted, and eventually we've launched, and we're starting to get that traction that we've been looking for. And it's something that I've always wanted to do, interviewing the world's best leaders in business, in leadership. And I wanted to do it on the YouTube platform. I wanted to do it on a couple of different platforms. But when I figured out the podcasting, which wasn't that long ago, a little bit like what you were telling me at the pre-interview conversation, I found that I'm going to use this platform, and whatever happens, I'm going to do it. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Yes, and like I told you, I checked it out on iTunes, and I see that your show is definitely growing. And we'll definitely put a link to that in the show notes as well, so that anyone who's checking out this episode will have the opportunity to check out your podcast as well. And a little
Mm.
bit less comfortable, perhaps. Maybe you can tell us, and I know sometimes these are more illuminating and better learning experiences than successes, are perhaps an early failure, where something you may have, a decision you may have made, or a position that you may have been in, and maybe reacted in a way or acted in a way that, in hindsight, you say, "Hey, maybe I should have done it differently." And is there maybe something that you've learned from that experience?
Yeah, look, the situation that I'll probably want to share with your listeners who are in a 9 to 5 role, and they're listening to us discussing here, and they're thinking, maybe one day I want to do something on the side, or I want to actually start something full time, or maybe after I retire. The key thing that I felt was a low moment for me was when that story that I was just sharing before, when I was just made redundant that second time in that finance manager role, because I actually didn't have any savings. There was no payout because that role, I had only been in that role for 9 months. And so we had just bought a house like 2 years prior or something like that. And we just refinanced it, put it back on the market to get out and to do something different. We're going to get into that student project because, everything just collided at the same time. My wife was going for surgery the next day. And so it was really just a point where, you're driving out your driveway and you're looking back and you're thinking, yeah, I drive a nice car, but, somebody else is owning this car because it's under finance. Are they going to come and repossess it? And, you find yourself, in the welfare line, trying to access welfare funding from the government, and all those difficult moments. And you're thinking, I studied hard, I went to school, I did this, and I've generated a good income. I had a good plan, but then everything hinges on a month-to-month paycheck, which the bulk of the population relies on. But we all need to come to a point of understanding that could go away because something has happened to the company. That could go away because something has happened to the economy. That could go away because of something that is outside of our control. So at best, you've got to get your mindset right and fortify that mindset to say, if that happened and I had savings, what would I do? If that happened and I didn't have savings, what would I do? The good news is, most economies, you will be able to get back up on your feet, get something different, but then start to build an alternative.
Nice. So, from what I understand from that, it sounds like there was a level of complacency that if this is the way it is now, this is the way it's going to stay, and nobody expects the tremendous financial upheaval of 2008, 2009, where there were many layoffs from very talented, experienced executives on very high levels, and the first time I was told that everybody is replaceable. I'm like, no, not everybody's replaceable. No one can do this as good as I can. But then I found out, like you did, through a different experience, but that, yeah, I can move on to a different company. I can move on to a different position. The next person will come in and may do things a little bit differently and may perhaps won't know all the systems that I put in place, but they'll do things their way and the job will get done. So that's a really important lesson of, not falling into complacency, and at the same time also having that backup plan. Another point, though, is you feel that you have found, I strongly believe in that every single person is unique and every single person has a superpower. The show is called Love Your 9 to 5. It doesn't mean that everyone has to be an hourly employee. It just means that whatever you're doing and using your time doing, make sure it's something that fits with who you are uniquely, and not just fits, that that you have the opportunity to express your unique, special powers. And I'm not saying that everybody is Superman, but everybody's got something. So you clearly have come in touch, definitely at some level, with your unique skills and your passions, and you have the opportunity to express them in some of the ways that we discussed.
Mm.
How did you, what was the process that you did to get in touch with really who you are? And do you have any suggestions for the listeners for them to come in contact with who they are on a very deep level to be able to really kind of explode professionally in a very positive way.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I mean, what I've found is it does take time, and I'm still going through that process myself to work out really, what am I absolutely on fire about constantly that I can continue to do, even in difficult moments. And it's interesting because I actually lead a music team as part of our local church network here in Melbourne, and just last Saturday, we were having a meeting throughout the whole day because we're preparing for a pretty big concert coming up. So we're pretty excited about that. But my wife was all.
You really do quite a variety of things, I must say. Your finance and your coaching and your podcasting. You got your music going on the side. Good for you.
So full schedule, man. Full schedule. Yeah. So all those things. So I was pulling out the whiteboard and looking for all the whiteboard markers. And as I was doing that, I just felt it in my gut to say, wow, I feel like I'm going to run a workshop or a training session. And I got just that little bit of an excitement. And I was having this conversation in my head that say, you really do love standing up and training and writing on the whiteboard. And that's something that I didn't know I loved, but it's come over time as people have asked me to speak during my professional career to train maybe junior graduates in how to audit a school or things like that. And then over time, I've been asked to speak in front of the church, in front of our music teams, and then I've run my own workshops. And so my point is, it's evolved over time, and the different opportunities come up. And once you execute on it, you get the feedback, and people come up to you and say, hey, I like the way you teach that. I've heard that concept taught before, but I've never really heard it from that perspective. I like the way you do this. I like the way that, when I make an error, you're able to coach me back into the right way, or people who are working in my team will come up and say, you're a better coach than other managers that I've worked for in this organization or in other organizations. So you start to pick up on those things, and it takes a little bit of time, but above all, it's personal development, reading and having people to mentor you and having, accountability to different people.
Well, excellent. So you really just gave us a lot of valuable information right there. I mean, I pulled out of that the way that you really just listened when people say things. Davis, you're really good at teaching. You're a natural in front of the whiteboard, and you kind of you listen to that. You listen to what people are telling us. And usually it's the people who are not intentionally giving us the advice that sometimes it's completely authentic and genuine. I really like for the audience to be able to walk away from every episode with something actionable, something they could put into practice right away, something that, maybe a tool, maybe a trick. I don't know if anything comes to mind, but when you think of it, it's something like a small win where they can get a little bit better each day, and they can really learn, something with getting in touch with who they really are.
One thing that I did probably about 2 years ago that I think, I believe has helped me get to where I am right now with my podcast and some of my other coaching and outreach is I, for some reason, made a decision to focus on building my LinkedIn profile to some reasonable level. And at that time, I probably had about 300 connections on LinkedIn. And I know it's a little bit off the side, but I think I'll bring this into our conversation, and I think somebody will probably be able to walk away with something. So I hired a personal branding coach called Andrew Ford from the Social Star here in Melbourne, and he's a good friend of mine now. And I've done a couple of his courses and stuff, so I'd highly recommend socialstar.com.au and to reach out to Andrew. Yeah, and so I hired him for about maybe 4 months or so, and the biggest thing he did for me is he kept me accountable. Every single week I published a blog post on LinkedIn. That is something that I had never done before, and I was very fearful about prior to that. But what it did is it allowed me to just become bolder in what I could do on my LinkedIn profile. Most people on their LinkedIn profiles, if we're talking people who are employed by somebody else, their tagline is actually their employment position. Nothing wrong with that. But if you're trying to attract a new role, or if you're trying to switch careers, you've got to work on that tagline that can be attractive to recruiters who are trying to approach you from the other industry. Or if you're trying to, maybe you're about to finish off with that company, something is up the chain, you that's one thing you can do. Some people don't have photos on their LinkedIn profile. Some people don't actually have any decent summary of what their skills or what their achievements have been on their LinkedIn profile. So this is one strategy that is easy to execute for somebody listening today and say, Davis, what can I walk away from this conversation? I've invested half an hour of my time listening to you two guys have a chat, but you go away and execute on this, and you're going to begin to see dividends from it, because people pay attention to LinkedIn. LinkedIn is ranked very high by Google. It's indexed really high. It's got a high page ranking, and if you actually get the vanity URL in LinkedIn, which is linkedin.com/Davis Mutabwa, for instance, that actually anytime somebody searches your name on Google, you probably that profile will rank number one, unless you've got your own blog site. You want to do that, and then you want to start approaching people. Optimize your LinkedIn profile by filling out your essentially your resume, but summarizing it in a nicer way without highlighting I did this, but in a nice summarized high level way. But fill it out, put in your qualifications, because that helps you reach more people who've come from the same school you went to. All those little warm touches help people feel connected to you. So if I went to Monash University here in Melbourne doing my postgrad, and someone else is a Monash alumni, they will feel like, oh, we went to Monash. That's a conversation starter. So you fill out all that information. It's not too much about invading your privacy. It's just about getting on with networking. You would tell somebody that if you met them in person. So why wouldn't you tell them if you're trying to network with them online? So bottom line, I grew my network from about 300 connections to close to 5,000 connections right now on LinkedIn. Now, for some people, that's nothing, but for me, it allowed me to receive inbound requests like this podcast, case in point, because I believe my LinkedIn profile is a strong profile, and it allows people like yourself, Shmuel, to be able to look at it and say, well, this dude maybe have something to offer. And being able to pick up consulting engagements, because people will go to your LinkedIn profile and see that you're legit, you're genuine, and you've worked in some places where maybe their friends have worked, or whatever the case might be. So a couple of key things, if I just summarize that, make sure you've got a strong profile photo for LinkedIn. Make sure you've got a strong tagline that kind of encompasses a couple of your key strengths. So for me, you heard when Shmuel was talking about, I'm a podcaster, I'm a church branding strategist, I'm a dynamic chartered accountant, and I'm a startup consultant. Those are some of my taglines that are on my LinkedIn profile. And then you have a good summary, run through all the roles that have been important in your career, essentially complete your profile, even your social interests. So you'll see on my LinkedIn profile, my music is on there, my church work is on there, because some of the people will connect with me because they've had a history working with the youth in the church or something similar, in charity organizations. So all of those things, you never know which one will open the door for you to your next interview, to your next business project, business opportunity. So that's my takeaway. I hope that's of value to somebody.
That is awesome. I was tempted to interrupt you so many times there, but really, for the audience's sake, I kept my mouth shut. But that really was extremely valuable. Now I know what you've done is over the top for your LinkedIn profile. I'm actually looking at it right now. It's not the first time I've seen it, but it definitely pops when you look at it. I read your entire summary, and I see all the articles that you have, and it definitely presents very, very well. And I've seen people very high up in various positions who have very weak LinkedIn profile. Two other points that you just said is be real, be authentic. People are kind of don't really trust social media as being real life. Like you said something very smart, that if you would do it, if I met you, if I sat next to you on the plane, we would discuss certain things. So you could put that on your LinkedIn profile. That's who you really are. There's so much opportunity, to kind of explain who you are. I wouldn't even say bragging rights or showing off a little bit, but just, people should be able to have that conversation just by reading your profile. It should be the first 5 minutes of any conversation had you met them in a train station, on a plane, or any other place. The other thing you mentioned is be bold, in a professional way, but it's okay. You have things to say. So if I want to summarize your 1 minute takeaway, is really for anyone who's listening, can focus specifically on LinkedIn, and to try to grow those connections. And all of your connections you have other connections. Find the college that you went to, find the company that you work for now, the company that you used to work for, and really start building that connection, and really great things can happen. So just before we close up here, Do you have any particular, I'm not going to say books, but maybe one particular book? I know you mentioned Rich Dad, Poor Dad before, and I'll definitely put a link to that in the show notes, but any other particular book that has particularly influenced you that you think might be beneficial for the audience as well, maybe to read that book?
Yeah, I think I probably could default to that book, Rich Dad Poor Dad, because it's interesting. I was interviewing a guy called Keurig Ashley here in Australia, originally from the US, and he's done some speaking engagements with Robert Kiyosaki on stage because he's a success coach and a professional speaker as well. So he was actually saying, the story in that book is actually not a real story. There is no rich dad and there is no poor dad. It's just a way to embed a training philosophy that Kiyosaki received. But I love that book in terms of how it opens up your mind, especially from the real estate angle, but it embeds it within the philosophy of generating passive income using real estate or using shares and things like that. So I think that's what I'd say.
Perfect. So is that your final answer, or do you want a lifeline? I'm just joking. But Rich Dad, honestly, I have not read that book, and I definitely will. And I definitely appreciate it, and I hope that the audience will appreciate that as well. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, what is the best way? Obviously, your LinkedIn profile, Davis Mutabwa on LinkedIn. They can definitely search for that. But how else would it be? Would you recommend for people to get in touch with you?
So I would actually encourage everybody to, number one, just go and subscribe to the Business Generals podcast on iTunes. You can either search for Davis Mutabwa and the podcast will come up. Subscribe to that, and then also jump onto businessgenerals.com and download our most popular episodes.
Davis, I really appreciate your time. It's been really exciting. Maybe one day you'll come to America, or maybe one day I'll end up in Australia. You never know. The world gets smaller, especially as more and more people interact in these types of ways. But really, I really appreciate your time early in the morning today, and with the information that you shared. And I look forward to continuing this relationship.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you having me on the show, Shmuel, and it's been awesome to have a chat. And hopefully we'll reconnect again soon. Thank you so much.
In summing this all up, I think we can really all learn from Davis how to deal with our professional challenges. Davis was let go from a great job and immediately set out on another career, first in real estate, and then he started his very own podcast. When the going is tough, we just need to look into ourselves and to see how we can innovate even further. As always, if you've enjoyed this episode and have grown professionally from this, do me this little favor: subscribe on iTunes and leave me a nice review. This will help others learn and discover about this show too. I look forward to joining you again next week, and until then, look into yourself, find your inner self, accept it, be proud of it, and learn how to express it.